Welcome, everybody. My name is Linda Jacobson. I am a reporter for the 74. Thanks for coming out today. Just to get started, I thought I'd say, we've got a project coming out this week on enrollment trends this school year. And, just from working on that project, there's still considerable movement in and out of traditional public schools this year. And so this feels like a very timely conversation about where are those kids going and, what sort of choices, have opened up for families over the past 2 years. So I'll just do a couple of quick introductions here. We have Hanna Skandera with the Daniels Fund, which supports charter schools and choice options. Next to her, we have Rees with the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools. I always have to make sure I get that name right, who I hit up for answers quite often on stories I'm working on. We have Derrell Bradford with 50 CAN, which advocates for policy changes to focus
the whole
on
shebang.
the kids have a quality school to attend. Does that work? We have Joseph Connor with Agora, which I need to learn more about. It's a platform for focusing on education savings accounts. Is that correct? And also some background with microschools as well. And then finally, Greg Richmond with the Archdiocese of Chicago, superintendent of schools there. So just to start off, Hanna, I'll send the first question to you, but anybody can respond. Talk a little bit about why this moment in the choice movement is different, sort of the foundation for what we've seen over the past 2 years.
Yeah, I think I'll state the obvious. There's just so many, there's a convergence right now of so many different things. We had COVID. I feel like we have a teacher crises in the sense of just pipeline and human capital pipeline. We've got parents more engaged than ever. I don't know how long that'll last. I think that's a healthy question to engage. But from my vantage point, missed opportunity if we're not thinking about how, I think about all the time I spent as the Secretary for Education in New Mexico going, how do we get parents more engaged? And I know it's a really tough time, but we just got served on a platter, parents more engaged. And I feel like this is a moment to ask, what are we going to do about that? How do we do that? And by the way, I don't think that moment will last for forever. And so I'm now at a fund, the Daniels Fund, and we have an aggressive goal of 100,000 new choice seats in our 4 states that we fund by 2030, because I do believe this is a moment.
Anybody else want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I agree with everything Hanna said. In the charter school sector, we saw an increase in enrollment of 240,000 students in the 2020-21 school year. Charter schools responded very effectively to COVID, and that's partially why the numbers went up. So whether these families will stay in our system remains to be seen. So far, anecdotally, we seem to think that they're staying in many communities. In fact, the enrollment rates are going up. So in those places where options were made available, parents took advantage of them because the school districts were not responsive to the needs of families. And so I think it's a trend we should definitely lean into, but I agree with Hanna in that window may have closed in some places to the extent parents are just tired of the pandemic and want things to go back to normal. Unfortunately, we cannot reopen that window, but I still think as advocates, we need to make sure we're pushing as much as possible. And in many states, we've already seen the fruits of our labor in places like New Mexico. They just passed the facilities finance bill, which was unheard of with bipartisan support. So legislatively, in a lot of states, we've seen huge positive momentum in favor of school choice and charter schools in particular.
Can I throw one thing out there about this? I also think now is a really important time to redefine what school choice is, because it's different. So the paradigm normally is that the government buys you a seat and you may or may not like that seat, and we want you to be able to choose a different seat, right? So it's sort of very like place-based. I think that's a powerful paradigm, like it's one that shaped my life a lot, and it's a strong paradigm for very good reasons. At the same time, like over the last 2 years, what I think school choice has become is that here is some money. I am a parent. How am I solving a problem of education for my kid that has emerged for a wide variety of reasons, like pandemic-related or otherwise. So sometimes those questions were solved by getting a different seat. So if you were in Chicago public schools, your schools weren't open, if you wanted to go to Catholic school in Chicago, you could have bought a seat there, right? That is one way to do it. At the same time, in some places, it's like, well, you know, the virtual I'm getting is crap. I need a support mechanism to make sure that it's not that bad, right? Or like, I'm racing through the curriculum I have during the day, I need some sort of enrichment, right? Or me and the 5 people next to me are worried about our health, we wanna hire a teacher and do a pod, right? And so there's all this different behavior that has presented itself, I think, as like what school choice is now, and I also think it would be unfortunate to miss that opportunity.
One thing I should note is that we don't necessarily have somebody with us today who sort of represents the traditional district school perspective, you know, so sort of keep that in mind.
But you could draw like a little person over there that was like, I'm against all of this.
Or if somebody wants to volunteer.
And sad things are happening right now.
I know in my reporting I've talked to, you know, parents who left for homeschooling or left for pods or some of these new types of arrangements who, you know, either in the middle of last school year or this school year have gone back to their district school. You know, it's not been a sustainable solution for them. You know, talk a little bit about what has emerged and you know, how can you continue? You don't want more disruption in kids' lives, you know, as they're going in and out of these different systems. But, you know, are some of these changes sustainable?
Right. So I think one of the most exciting things that's come out of the last 2 years is parents really choosing themselves what they think is best for their children. I think prior to that, a lot of school choice has often been top down. And as other people in the panel were saying, I think for kind of the first time, parents were choosing what they thought was best. And so I saw that firsthand. The organization I founded, Schoolhouse, we set up 50 micro schools across the country in the space of a few months because of the pandemic. Now, over time, I think people are trying to struggle with, okay, we like this alternative that we found, but how can we make it sustainable? How can we continue to fund it? And so I think that's the major issue that people at the state level, the local level, and federal level need to figure out, which is, okay, look, we had this kind of 2-year period of change. People chose micro schools, they chose learning pods, they chose online schools. It's clear that there's demand for that, but the only way that those choice is gonna be able to continue is if we actually put in place policies like microgrant programs, like education savings accounts, like other things like that, that actually allow parents to continue to exercise that option.
Greg, what have you seen?
Well, I can speak to what I'm seeing in Chicago, some of it is perhaps different than what we predicted 2 years ago. We said was going to happen. Like if you'd come to an event like this, well, what, 2 years and 3 months ago, there was a lot of talk about the pandemic is going to create a revolution in learning, new technologies, unbundling of education, distance learning. What we saw in Chicago was actually a movement toward in-person learning. Like Catholic school enrollment went up in this fall. It's going to go up again this coming fall because people wanted to be in person. So at the same time, the public schools were losing enrollment. They weren't in person. They were trying lots of new platforms. People weren't happy with them. They moved to an in-person setting. In our own system, last school year, we offered both in-person and virtual. And we started the school year with about 6,000 families that signed up for virtual. So that was about 15% of our families. During the year, that number went down. The beginning of the school year, we offered it again. We had 30 families that signed up for it. We're down to about 15. So from that to me, that was a movement toward a desire for in-person. Honestly, I don't think the academic quality through the virtual offerings has been there. And people have been looking for personal connections and relationships for their kids. So what we're seeing in our city is a movement toward in-person. It's not to say that everybody wants that. There clearly are a variety, lots of different families, lots of different interests and needs. But what we experienced for the past 2 years is a little bit the opposite of what I think a lot of us thought was going to happen in the
What about
pandemic.
financially?
What, in what way?
What about families being able to afford?
Oh, well, we do have a scholarship, a tax credit scholarship program. So we have we have a very diverse school system. Our system covers the city and about half of the suburbs. We have schools in the city where everybody is on a tax credit scholarship or some other kind of scholarship. And a lot of those schools, none of the kids are Catholic. We have middle-class schools where the families really have to struggle to pay $5,000 tuition for 2 kids. And then we have schools in very wealthy communities that the parents are not struggling to pay tuition for their kids. So we are seeing more people come to us, even though it's not free, and trying to find the ways to pay for it.
There's obviously a lot of interest in, the gaps, achievement gaps growing wider during this time. Just talk a little bit about the role of choice in addressing some of those gaps. I mean, I was at the South by Southwest conference and heard of some interesting models with districts actually still using a pod structure as well. So sort of some of these hybrid types of partnerships, coming along, which kind of, I don't know if we'll see more of that, but.
I'll jump in quickly and just say, I want to double down on one thing you said, Derrell, and that is we are supporting a lot of charter schools in our initiative, around 100,000 new seats, but I actually do fundamentally believe there's a whole new wave of just innovation, and now sitting in a philanthropic role, it is, in my opinion, philanthropy's role to inspire and be agile and innovative in this moment. So I just want to say that Stand Together started something called the VELA Fund, and we are modeling that in our 4 states. And it is basically seeding micro school, any kind of innovative opportunity in the ed space not at scale, with the idea of scaling over time, because it's a moment. And I do think, what's the role of choice? The role of choice is to give parents, in my opinion, better options, and that might be in their eyes, not mine, but to give them better options for their kids. And in closing achievement gaps right now, I know in Colorado, 15% of our schools are charter schools. And our 4th graders on the NAEP, so in 2019, so it's a little delay here in the timing, but scored in 4th grade math the top in any district across the country, if you count them as a district. So, and in 8th grade math and 4th grade reading, 2nd. So this idea that I think some folks are wondering about choice and charters in particular, and do they give options that might be better? I would say, yeah. And our kids are really diverse in Colorado, so I'm bullish on that piece.
Can I jump on that? So I got to put my hater hat on here a little bit, right? So there's going to be a little nice bucket of haterade coming. I kind of think there are 2 kinds of schools right now with regard to learning gaps. There are schools that think those gaps are real, and there are schools that say kids are resilient and that don't take them seriously, all right? And you can look at the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or the Washington Post, and there are plenty of, not the 74, of course, because they're
Of course not.
and there are plenty of people who are really politically interested in acting like the last 2.5 years didn't happen, and like it's not going to take us 10 years to help kids who missed a reading window in the last 2 years recover from that. That's real, right? So I just want to highlight that, and I think that like it's good to be reductionist about it.
Focusing on what they've gained.
That's right. That's like look at all the the sort of like nature walks they took, whatever. Like I like nature walks, but still. So I do just want to say that like I think that that is a real paradigm that people are choosing in right now that like lives above all these other things. So that's the first thing. The second thing I would just say is that it's like I think choice is as a mechanism is an essential like force to help navigate a universe where there are people who are trying to take these gaps seriously and people who are not taking them very seriously. And from like a political standpoint, like I look at my state, the corrupt burg of New Jersey. And we have, like, particularly in charter world, right, some of the highest performing, most studied charter worlds, like charter schools in the galaxy, like literally. And our governor won't let them expand by 300 seats, right? And this is a school that is incredibly well positioned, a set of schools incredibly well positioned to deal with these kinds of gaps, right? So for the kids who can make it into the seats that are available, like, I think they are wildly well positioned to recover. For the 300 kids who aren't going to, right, or for everybody else who must prove their resilience, not so much.
Anybody else? Shift gears a little bit here and talk about charter schools, the conversation over religious organizations running charter schools. I know there's a federal case right now that a lot of people are watching over the definition of whether charters are public or private, which is sort of oversimplifying that, but that's the way the takeaway that some people have. Will we see, Nina, more religious organizations jumping in?
By the way, Nina is great.
As a preface to whatever my answer is going to be. Well, first of all, there are a couple of things that I need to just highlight. So there is a Blaine Amendment case that the Supreme Court is considering, and some of the discussions around whether charter schools can set up religious entities is connected to whether that case is, deemed constitutional and encourages the creation of potentially religious charter schools. Charter schools are public schools, so in that respect, they cannot teach religion. That case is confined to private schools and private education, and if it's deemed constitutional, I would imagine other states that have Blaine amendments will think twice, and those Blaine amendments will be struck. And it's a window of opportunity for Catholic schools to expand, and if I were betting on expanding Catholic schools right now, and there are organizations that do that, I would focus on that. I do not think it's wise to do this in the context of charter schooling, because you also invite all the other rules and things that public schools are held accountable to in a charter setting. Greg and I talked about this yesterday, so to the extent there are discrimination laws, for instance, that charters need to adhere to in order to receive federal funds. So once it's a religious entity, those whatever we do needs to adhere to those federal rules and regulations. So that's one thing. The case you talk about, though, is out of North Carolina. It's a case...
And I didn't mean to conflate those two, but some people try to make the connection.
Yeah, so just to dumb it down as much as I possibly can, so the fact that, whether charters are public or private gets discussed a lot in the court, sort of in discussions about what we are and what we look like. So the only state that deems charters as political subdivisions, fully public entities, is the state of Texas. In most other places, it hasn't been decided as to whether they're public or private. For us, though, it's important that we remain public because we are public. As I said, we tap into federal resources of funding. We want to redefine what public education is. So that particular case right now was an ACLU case that was brought against a school that had a uniform in place, and the girls in that school did not like the uniform rule, and the school argued that it is a private entity, and the court in which this case was being argued deemed the school as private, and so that's what's being challenged in federal court, and we'll see what happens. It's hard to guess as to what this particular court is going to do and say, but we definitely don't think that we're private agents.
If the court does rule for the charter, what are the implications of that?
Well, so the ACLU could appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court, and it will be a case that the U.S. Supreme Court needs to decide. There is a piece by Nicole Garnett from Notre Dame University which makes the case that for charter schools to teach religion and to be, able to have more freedoms and flexibilities, that they should organize as private entities. We don't agree with that, of course, but that is just a school of thought that select few are pushing. And again, our goal is to redefine what public education is and get public schools to look more like charter schools with the freedoms that come with everything that we did during COVID hinged on the fact that we had the freedom and flexibility that our authorizers gave us to move money around, to get teachers to learn how to teach online. All those things are things that I would imagine public schools want to do, and they should be taking lessons from us rather than, pushing in the other direction. And I think this bridge that we have between public and private is a very important one that needs to remain in place. But Derrell may disagree.
Well, he might.
You might find out.
Or he might agree. I spent 25 years in the charter school space, specifically in the authorizing space, and then the past 9 months in the Catholic school space. And people have asked me recently if it becomes possible for religious schools to become charter schools, would I support that in my new role? And I've said no. Because of the level of intrusion into, even in the charter school space, in terms of the operation of the schools, the oversight, the behaviors of authorizers. We tend to talk a lot about what's happening on state legislative level, what do the laws say, but there's a whole nother level of activity. What is your authorizer doing to you? And I wouldn't want to expose the school, I have 154 schools, to that. Even if they could become, if they could convert, still be a Catholic school that is a charter school, I wouldn't want them to do it. And one of the things we haven't talked on here yet that is part of, it has always been part of the choice space, but I think it has really come to the fore in the past couple of years, is that a lot of people are fleeing, a lot of people are choosing not because of test scores, they're choosing to flee the public system. And there's a perception now that public education has become very politicized. And you just watch the latest school board meeting, and people are looking for ways to get out of that. They don't want their kids' education to be politicized. And the private school space provides that for those people who are looking for that. So that's, I think, a major factor in what has been increasing the enrollment in private schools the past few years. Are parents looking just to get out of the political chaos that they see in the public space.
Can I throw some comic relief on that? So, like screwdrivers have a lot of work to do without trying to be hammers, right? And so for me, this is a problem. This is like a cure looking for a disease. The idea that we need private schools to be charter schools, to me, sort of mixes the worst of both in a lot of ways, right? And just to be clear, if you ever needed proof that parents need access to schools that the government doesn't run, look at the last 2 years, right? So taking independent schools and subjecting them to public school governance, to me, is not an ideal solution. But there is, I do want to say to Greg's point, though, we do let private schools turn into charter schools. In my corrupt Asperg of New Jersey, we let you do that, right? So there is a conversion law on the books that let, for instance, St. Philip's Academy, which was a high-performing, excellent Episcopalian independent school in Newark that served the black kids of Newark extremely well for a very, very long time, is now Phillips Academy and can expand, right? Because it went from being a pay model that was a private school to being a charter school that is now the subject of crappy charter school politics in my state. So to me, the answer to that would have been give the parents some money so they can go to St. Philip's, right? St. Philip's solves a discrete set of problems for families that lots of charter schools kind of solve, but not necessarily. And independent school governance, just like charter school, nonprofit governance with authorizers, just like school board governance, they give you different kinds of good, right? Like you can get, like to me, districts do magnets well, right? Like they do selective well. Like I think that's one of the things that district governance gives you. I wouldn't want to throw that away any more than I would want to throw the independent mission-based governance, that a Catholic school gives you, because different families want different things.
staying on the charter school subject a little bit, we're in California, so I thought this would be relevant. The California Democratic Party recently adopted a platform in support of charter schools for the way that they've served Black students, other underrepresented populations. Could that trickle to other states up to, I mean, and it seems to be obviously a clash with what the Biden administration now wants to see in the charter school program. So is that, a major development in this space?
Oh, absolutely. And Margaret Fortune from Fortune Schools is the one who led this effort successfully. If you recall, a few years ago, the NAACP called for a moratorium on charter schools. The Democratic Party platform at the federal level has been amended over time. So the fact that California, the second state to pass a charter school law, the state which has marks the largest number of growth in terms of individual schools and kids going to charter schools, did this is extremely important. And hopefully other states and other individuals, charter advocates will follow Margaret's lead. But she understood how to work the system to get that done. And most of our leaders are running schools. I mean, that's why they're attracted to this cause. They're not here to go and sit in these long meetings and understand the political process, which unfortunately our opposition is very skilled at leveraging.
I think in a lot of ways, state politics can often be a lagging indicator. I think in this case, it's someone kind of getting out ahead of it. But the thing that I've seen talking to parents across the country the last 2 years is that overall support for any type of school choice, whether it's charters, ESAs, tax credits, scholarships, vouchers, has gone up. Both parties, independents, across every single demographic group that they can poll. So I think what you're going to see in the next year or two is hopefully more of this, where there are people at the state level, whether they're passing legislation, they're putting something in the platform, where they're actually responding to the fact that over the last 2 years, a lot of parents went through a school experience that they really didn't like. And they don't want to have to go through that again, and they need access to school choice programs, whether that's tax credit scholarships, charters, or ESAs.
And some of these models, like microschools, are out in front of policy. Talk a little bit about what states might do with these in turn. Is that something you're concerned about as far as regulating some of these
stand-up
models?
person over there, or you want to give?
I think microschools are a really cool innovation. I mean, I worked in charters before moving into microschools and then moving to ESAs. The thing that has always struck me about microschools and learning pods is we talk a lot about parent choice. A lot of those are parent created. These learning pods and microschools weren't created because people were sitting back and trying to think of, hey, what policy innovations could we come up with? It was, hey, the local public school is closed. I need childcare and academics for my kids today. Let's get 5 other kids today, and me and the other parents will kind of switch off teaching duties. I know teachers who left private schools, who started their own microschools, are now making better livings than at their previous jobs. So I think in a lot of ways, parents were out in front during the pandemic just because of necessity, right? And what you're seeing policy try to catch up to that. So I think ESA programs, microgrant programs, the Vela Foundation, they're all kind of following the lead of the parents who essentially kind of chose and picked what they thought worked best. And now state policymakers are trying to figure out, okay, hey, is there money in the budget so that we can support these micro schools, we can support these learning pods? And I think that's going to be the big fight over the next couple of years, which is how many of these things can survive because we can get them some type of state funding if that's what they need.
But what about regulations? I guess I'm curious about
Yeah.
boundaries around these types of
Yeah, no,
models.
so it's interesting. So having run micro schools, regulations generally are kind of the dog that didn't bite with micro schools and learning pods. So I think there was a lot of noise made about regulations in a lot of different states. Texas actually passed a preemption law excluding micro schools from any type of local regulation. But in most cases, it was the type of thing where it was an emergency need, and then majority of people ended up going back to the public schools. And so, those policymakers then kind of thought it wasn't a big threat, and so they didn't really follow through with that. I think in the years to come, there's a lot of, I think, work that needs to go into, okay, what is a learning pod, right? Because you can have a learning pod that's under the homeschool statute. You can have it under private school statute. Public schools sometimes open up learning pods, charters do. And so I think there needs to be kind of a conversation that really hasn't started in most of the states about, hey, what do these innovations look like, right? Where do homeschool co-ops fall in? Where do micro schools fall in? But so far, I'd say regulation hasn't been the obstacle for that. I think it's really funding. It's that people made sacrifices for a year or two to go to that micro school or learning pod, but they can't continue to do that without some type of funding stepping in.
Yeah, Hannah.
I'll just say, as you were talking, I was thinking what Derrell said earlier about just the redefining of the education space and our definitions. And I think if we are successful in thinking about what's possible for our kids going forward, we will see a lot of new definitions that emerge. We are way too constrained right now. We've got the public thing, we've got the private thing, and then we've got the non-traditional public charter, right? I mean, I'm like, that is way too simple, frankly. And I think there's a whole pathway forward, and whether it's driven by money and how we, right, whether the regs drive it, if we're smart, we'll drive it, and parents will drive it, and demand different definitions to meet the needs for their kids versus government. To your point, maybe ketchup's good because it allows a front runner or front runners to actually put out new definitions that we're so non-creative. I can say this having worked in government a long time. So non-freaking creative about our definitions and about what's possible for kids, that maybe we ought to take a back seat and let some innovation and some smart people come forward and bring a new way of thinking about how we educate our kids. So I think there's a possibility we should not miss.
I found a new definition in a report I was, when I was working on this enrollment story. They call them hybrid schools, and it has nothing to do with in-person or virtual, but families who attend sort of a large homeschooling group for part of the week, and the rest of the week maybe they're at home just being homeschooled, and these, and they're not co-ops because the parents aren't necessarily doing the teaching. I mean, their teachers are hired for these, but that was one of the new definitions I came across. So in the last little bit of time we have here, just quickly, what are you seeing in sort of your world that you're most excited about right now?
Well, again, I am extremely bullish and optimistic about charter schools in every state where governors or state leaders had the opportunity to do something transformative last year. They did so. This year is an election year, so it's a little bit harder to see. People are busy getting reelected, so I don't know if it's going to be as robust this year as it was last year, but at the state level, governors from Tennessee to even like New York now we have a mayor in New York City who is strong on charter schools for the first time. So, not for the first time, since the last mayor.
In a minute.
In a minute. So I think I love all the discussions around innovation, but I do think that to the extent you need still a brick and mortar school where parents have to go to work and drop their kids somewhere, charter schooling offers you the best opportunity to do that. And we need to make sure that we're keeping innovation alive and well in the chartering space so that they can take some of these liberties. Things like micro schools, which were born out of Arizona, those are very controversial from a political standpoint. So, and the math also doesn't always work because if your school is small, I mean, you're already at 70 cents to the dollar in terms of per pupil funding. So the funding needs to be there for this to take off. Maybe some of our larger networks can't afford to create smaller settings and whatnot. So, but to do that, you need to make sure you're really leaning into regulators at the federal level and the state level to make sure that they are opening and attracting new people to the space in order to create all of these things. Without a robust chartering system, I don't know how these things can really take off.
Derrell?
So 2.5 things, maybe 2 3/4 things. Also, Hanna is amazing as well. So the first thing, I'm working up to it. So the first thing, I guess one of the things I would say I'm excited about is that you can't do any of this shit unless you can pay for it, right? And so the fact that, to Joe's point, and actually to Greg's point about Illinois, the fact that people are undoing or redoing or modernizing their school finance arrangements is a good thing. I think direct aid to parents is an essential piece of that. Like, if you want to keep all this stuff in play, like, you got to give money to families so they can stand up a market for it. I think that's incredibly important. So I'm excited about that. I'm also excited about the fact that, in like 2019, this is stuff that I would talk to our executive directors about. You could look at Amanda's face right now, which would be like dire about this. And I'd be like, we should be doing this thing that's like, let's make the building the bad guy, right? Like, let's get outside, like, there's all this other stuff. And they'd be like, yeah, it sounds good, but it's never gonna happen. And then it happened, right? And then all of a sudden, we were like printing money and giving it to people. And it's like, go spend it, holler at me at the end. Like, there are all these, like, I got a school in my living room. All this stuff was going on that people thought would never happen. And all of a sudden, it was out there, right? And so I'm also excited about the fact that the creativity, ingenuity, and industriousness of the American people, moms, dads, black, white, purple, urban, suburban, rural, rose to this challenge and basically like fledged this sector that we were just like talking about like it would never happen, and then it was there. So that's like incredible, and I think all of those things need to be features of the education system of the future, right? The one we're trying to bring into existence now. So it's the last thing is that, like, it's a mistake to believe that people aren't going to try to smash this up. And I say, like, you can go on the internet and find out I'm a notorious charter school booster, right? But they're trying to smash charter schools up right now.
Derrell, she said, what are you excited about?
No, I gave the
This is telling. This is telling.
Well, I mean, you have to bring some verve to it, because you can't fight and be humdrum, right? So I'm just saying, like, I want people to get excited about making sure these things continue to have an opportunity to flourish, and regulation is the enemy of that flourishing. I'm sure all the ed tech folk in here will find that to be obvious. So,
Joe.
I think what I'm most excited about is what Derrell was talking about, which is direct aid to parents. Having started micro schools in 10 states, I finally decided to do something about it and actually start a new organization that helps states administer and run micro grants and ESA programs. It's called Agora. And the basic idea is that we need to build infrastructure in order to support these new innovations and allow states to actually have transparency into where these funds are going. So I'm really excited about that work and allowing kind of the new innovations that have flourished the last 2 years to hopefully get some financial support from that.
Got it. Greg?
I do think we're seeing, and we've talked about it, an increasing support for choice broadly. It relates a little bit, what I'm excited about relates to your question earlier about California, so I'll just put it in the context of Illinois. About 5 years ago, the prior governor, a Republican, created a tax credit scholarship program. Then there was a gubernatorial race. The Democratic candidate ran, one of his planks of his platform was to promise to get rid of that program, and he won. And then the pandemic happened. And last legislative session, he signed a bill to extend the sunset of that program. In this legislative session, we passed legislation to strengthen the program more with nearly unanimous numbers out of both chambers of the Illinois legislature, which is a supermajority Democratic legislative body. So those elected officials can see what's happening as well as we can. And see what their constituents, what their parents, what their voters are looking for in education and educational choices for their kids. So there's hopefully some reason to be optimistic. Can't take it for granted. You're right. It's not going to last forever. But maybe there's a pivot happening right now, which we can try to build on.
that was really positive.
Another
I feel,
story
like,
for me.
warm inside. That was like awesome.
Take that hater hat off.
Can I say one, in addition to everything that folks have said, one thing I'm excited about, new definitions, new models, absolutely new legislative platforms and approaches. I think we have an opportunity to have what I'll call a brass tops and a grassroots strategy that merge. And I feel like we've talked about for a long time, whether it's in advocacy or at state policy levels or whatever, you know, at the state level, I was always bemoaning we didn't have a grassroots game. At the grassroots level, I'm always like, why can't they get clear about how to move the top to, and I think we have a moment that we have grassroots and brass tops that could come together. And if we do and we leverage that, we could shift some of these big pieces on the chessboard. So,
Good way to wind up. Thank you.